Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this UKLFI Charitable Trust webinar on the 7th of October and the War of Return. In 2018, Dr. Einat Wilf and Dr. Adi Schwartz wrote their seminal book, The War of Return, and they attended a UKLFI webinar, Charitable Trust webinar in 2020, to explain their thesis that the wedded nature of international opinion to the Palestinian supposed right of return was the fundamental obstacle to peace between Israelis and Palestinians. Their work and their research has had a major impact on the development of Israeli policy towards UNRWA. They've now updated their groundbreaking book, focusing on the massacre of the 7th of October as the true manifestation of what return looked like, and arguing that the atrocities of that day were carried out in the name of this very notion of a right of return. The new edition of the book is out in Hebrew, Return in October, and an English translation is coming soon. But I'm delighted in the interim to reintroduce our two speakers, Dr. Einat Wilf and Dr. Adi Schwartz, to talk about the updates and their own assessment of the 7th of October in the context of the wider War of Return. Dr. Einat Wilf is the author of 8 books that explore key issues in Israeli society. She was a member of the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committees. Dr. Wilf has a BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD, and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. And Dr. Adi Schwartz is a researcher and author specializing in strategy and international relations, with a particular focus on the Arab-Israeli conflict. He serves as a consultant to both governmental and non-governmental organizations. He is a postdoctoral fellow at the Ben-Gurion Institute for the Study of Israel and Zionism in the Ben-Gurion University, and a research fellow at the Misgov Institute for National Security and Zionist Strategy. Ladies and gentlemen, may I invite you to put your questions into the Q&A facility in the usual fashion. They will inform our discussion after some initial presentations from Adi and from Einat. Adi, if I could invite you to start. We are very familiar with your thesis, and I invite our viewers also to have regard to that groundbreaking webinar in 2020, which is still on our UKLFI Charitable Trust YouTube channel. Help us understand your updates to the book and any updates to your thinking and your general assessment of what the right of return, or indeed the war of return, means after the 7th of October.
Good evening, and first of all, thanks for having us. I think that right after October 7th, both Einat and myself were discussing whether or not we have something new to say, whether or not the events of October 7th changed something in our thinking, or whether we can contribute somehow to the efforts of Israel after the horrific events. And I think that while both of us were, of course, very much surprised of what happened, I mean, especially how easy it was for Palestinians, and I'm saying Palestinians because, as we all remember, amongst the thousands of people who infiltrated and entered the Israeli territory, there were indeed, in the first phase, Hamas militants, combatants. But then afterwards, since it happened for so many hours, there were thousands of civilians, what we would call just regular Palestinians from Gaza. So, of course, that was very surprising, the way the IDF simply couldn't stop this invasion. But we were asking ourselves whether we were actually surprised by what happened, in the sense that this is what the Palestinians wanted all along. And I think that the answer here is no, because as we explained in the initial book, in the first version of the book, it's very different. I mean, we have to think about the situation in Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians in a few mindsets. I think there's the Israeli mindset and perhaps also the Western mindset. And then there's the Arab or Palestinian mindset. Israelis, and I think also in the West, see Israel as a, as a state that was established in 1948, a member of the United Nations, perhaps one of the 20 or 30 members of what we call the West, liberal democracies. Some people even say that we have nuclear weapons. We have seen the might of the Israeli Air Force against Iran. So there's no question about the legitimacy, or perhaps in the last couple of years, also in the West, that came to a different perspective. But generally speaking, Israel is an established state, and that's it. But for many Palestinians and millions around us in the Arab world, the Jewish state is still an idea which is unacceptable. So going back to 1948, this is, in their view, an abomination. The existence of a Jewish state is an injustice. And again, you know all the names such as Nakba that Palestinians for the last century, or certainly after the war of 1948, if I had to sum it up in one sentence, for them, the war is not over. Okay, so as long as they fight against the Jews, the war is not over. We can have our banks and our high tech and our beaches and, skyscrapers in Tel Aviv. But at the end of the day, if you ask most Palestinians, do they recognize the right of the Jews to exist here as a Jewish sovereign state with a Jewish majority? The overwhelming response would be certainly not. Now, what we have called or what we have witnessed or diagnosed in the first book, that all of this comes into the term of return. What does it mean, return? As you know, in the War of Independence of 1948, there was a certain number of refugees, as it happens in all other cases of conflict. But in this case, the refugees themselves and around them, the infrastructure of UNRWA and the international community, as you mentioned in your introduction, have created this notion that millions of human beings, notwithstanding the real international rights and in very much difference from any other group of refugees around the world, have some kind of a right of return into the state of Israel. Now, we have to explain what that return means. Return is a very physical perspective or a very physical notion of return, meaning that there are millions of human beings, millions of Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jordan, etc., who actually think that one day, hopefully for them very soon, they will be able to take their suitcases and go to what they perceive to be their lands, their homes, of course, inside the state of Israel. Jaffa, Ramla, Haifa, many other cities and villages where Palestinians once lived. Just to make clear, in the Gaza Strip, almost 75 or at least more than 70% of the population are registered by that same UNRWA as refugees. Now imagine what that means, right? Imagine that 2 out of every 3 Palestinians in Gaza does not even consider the Gaza Strip to be their home. They consider somewhere else, as we have seen very well on October 7th. So this is a very physical and actual return. But the return is also a mythical concept in the sense that we have to go back to return to the time where the state of Israel did not exist. So there's this notion of a paradise before 1948, where all Palestinians lived very peacefully. Everybody, every family had their own, olive trees and their own plots of lands, and they were so peaceful, etc., etc. And the state of Israel, and certainly not Zionism, with the notion of creating a Jewish state, that did not happen. We have to go back to the time beforehand. So return is both a very physical issue and a very mythical concept. Now, what we have seen on October 7th, and both Einat and myself found so much evidence for that. For example, and this is how we opened the new book, with many quotes of the leaders of Hamas, including Yahya Sinwar himself and many others, in publications, in Facebook posts, in Telegram posts, etc., all of Hamas, saying we are getting near to return. Okay, so we are fighting to return to our land. The notion of return appeared so, the word itself, return, appeared so many times in what they themselves have said, that it makes very clear that this is how they envisaged and how they wanted, how they perceived return to happen. On the morning of October 7th itself, the head of one of the hospitals in Gaza posted on the Facebook picture, like a drawing of many people entering through this hole in the fence, going from Gaza into the state of Israel. What actually happened, sorry, on October 7th, and then wrote, "We are coming back, we're returning with millions." So millions of us are returning. So I think that this puts into perspective the real event of what happened on October 7th. So October 7th wasn't just, a few thousand of Palestinians, radical terrorists who have nothing to do with the peaceful population of Gaza or something like that. No, this is part of the ideology of the last century. This is how they wanted to make it into reality. And unfortunately, for at least a couple of hours, they managed to do it, and we've seen the devastating effects. And this is why we thought that a new and more updated version was needed.
Adi, thank you so much for that initial overview. And Nat, before we move to the questions from the audience, which are already coming in, of course, UNRWA plays such a significant role, and you both explain the significance of its work over the decades in the original book, not just in perpetuating that refugee status, but also in the education and even indoctrination of generations towards exactly what Adi has just set out. Is there an update regarding UNRWA and, of course, its very participation in the 7th of October, not just theoretically, but practically also?
So, as I'm sure people here have heard, after October 7th, information came out that some of the people who are directly paid by UNRWA, so official UNRWA employees, participated in the massacre. Now, as a result, the focus was on those people. And both Adi and I have argued that is entirely the wrong focus. And I think it has been in the interest of UNRWA to focus only on those few supposed rotten apples. Just literally yesterday, UNRWA posted, "The Israeli government still refuses to give the evidence of where we breached our neutrality," and so forth. The assumption being that somehow outside those few butchers, UNRWA is a neutral, upstanding organization committed to the betterment of humanity. And Adi and I are still frustrated that this has been an entirely missed opportunity to highlight the fact that the entire organization should not exist. Because what we said is that when people focus, and again, there's a reason that UNRWA wants to focus there, when people focus on people who are directly paid by UNRWA, it allows people to not notice what UNRWA actually does. Because for many years, especially since there has been more focus on cooperation with terrorism, UNRWA and the Palestinians in Gaza, and it's the same thing, have been very careful to supposedly have separation. So, for example, in a family, the mother will be an UNRWA teacher and the father will be a Hamas butcher, but supposedly everything is fine. In the excitement of October 7th, some of the people forgot the need to keep that separation and participated in the general butchery. But the question that should have been asked is not how many people directly paid by UNRWA participated in the massacre. The question should have been, how many of those who participated in the massacre, how many were falsely registered as refugees, even though no one in Gaza is a Palestine refugee? How many lived in neighborhoods that are misnamed refugee camps, even though they're not camps, and no one there is a refugee? How many were educated in the UNRWA schools on the idea of return? If you had asked those three questions, how many of the participants in the massacre were registered, located, educated by UNRWA, the answer would have been all of them. Because UNRWA is the infrastructure of what we've come to call in the book Palestinianism. Palestinianism is the name that now we give to the ideology turned identity of the Arabs in Gaza, the West Bank, millions in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And this ideology and identity unites those Arabs in a singular obsession with the non-existence of the Jewish state. And UNRWA is fueling station number one of Palestinianism. UNRWA is an effective fueling station precisely because it appears to be UN. It claims to be neutral. It structurally cannot be neutral because it is a Palestinianist organization devoted to giving Western and UN cover to the idea of no Jewish state. So we are still stuck in a missed opportunity to highlight this issue. Even though the Israeli Knesset, for example, against the wishes of the Israeli government, voted to stop cooperating with UNRWA, which again, Israel does, we are still, as Israel, not highlighting what is really problematic. I will even highlight the whole notion of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation replacing UNRWA, if I may use the word, is bollocks, because I don't know how you pronounce it in British English, but the notion, because it basically actually enhances the idea that UNRWA is a humanitarian organization that needs to be replaced by another humanitarian organization. It's not. UNRWA is an organization singularly devoted to keeping Palestinianism fueled and financed until the Jewish state is no more. So if I may speak for Adi, I think we continue to be frustrated with the fact that even after everything that happened on October 7th, the focus remains on the question of whether some people who are directly funded by UNRWA participated in the butchery, rather than on focusing on the fact that the entire infrastructure funds an ideology that has to die.
Einat, thank you to both of you for highlighting this important issue, and I know that you have been actively involved in trying to raise awareness about the very negative impact of UNRWA, and I've also heard many detractors of UNRWA calling for its replacement as opposed to simply its abolition. So this is a very important aspect of the debate to be highlighting. I note that your overviews, both of them, focused, of course, on the notion of return from the Palestinian perspective. And I wonder whether you've made any assessment of what this narrative, false narrative, in fact, of return may have done to the international discourse and international consciousness of this issue. And in particular, whether you have seen it at play specifically in the supposed justification of the 7th of October. We have seen this in many respects from different sources, and they range from calling this, justified resistance to this didn't occur in a vacuum, and I'm sure our audience will be very familiar with some of the sources of those attempts to justify these barbarous atrocities. Have you seen the right of return in the way that you've analysed it deployed as part of that? And perhaps I can link this to one of the questions from the audience to start us off, which asks whether you can comment on the fact that in Western societies, many support the myth that Israel is not a legitimately established state, despite the fact that all the historical information is out there. So perhaps I could couple both of those questions together and ask if the narrative about the establishment of Israel and the notion of return have played a significant role in the discussions that you've participated in or witnessed since the 7th. Adi, could I throw that to you first off?
Oh, where should I start? There's so much to say. So let's start with the first part. I think that again, before October 7th, and unfortunately even after October 7th, there's a huge misunderstanding of the conflict. I think again, now let's talk about the establishment. Okay, I'm talking about governments. I think the British government, many other governments in the West, perhaps the Biden administration, now it's perhaps different with the Trump administration. But the understanding is something like this, if I have to say it in one sentence: the Palestinians want freedom. The Jews, for some reason, do not want to give it to them. And then obvious, this is the vacuum, right? This is the context. So poor Palestinians, they were caught up in this huge prison. Okay, so that's in Gaza, but the West Bank is the same. And again, you hear President Macron and others, we have to create a Palestinian state because obviously that was the problem. The problem is the inexistence of a Palestinian state. The Palestinians only want to have the state, and okay, there was this disgusting issue of the October 7th. The IDF did what it did, and now we have to solve the problem with the establishment of Palestinian state. Very nice, but that's not the problem. The issue, as we explain in the book, as we continue to explain and again and again and again, is not the inexistence of a Palestinian state, but the existence of the Jewish state. So that's why October 7th happened, and that is exactly why the establishment of a Palestinian state right now would do nothing to improve the situation, would not promote the chances of peace, and on the other hand, would most probably just create another launching pad for something similar, or at least with the same ideology as October 7th. But I think that most establishments, okay, most people who are in the establishment do not understand this, and this is a crucial point. Now, to the second part of what you said, again, one of the things that Einat and me noticed that when we research, talk, write about the conflict, we have to dig so many layers of lies. So first of all, there's a lot of simply ignorance about what actually happened in 1948. When people say that the state of Israel is illegitimate or whatever, people simply do not know the facts. For example, the League of Nations decisions that the entire project during the first half of the 20th century was very legitimate, was inside international law, was according to everything, all the decisions, and there was nothing unique. There are refugees and there are dead people in wars, all this stuff that somehow the Jews did something unbearable in 1948 or in Nakba or whatever. So you have to simply go one by one and refute many lies. And but I agree with you. In a sense, either people do not understand the nature of the conflict and think that perhaps establishing a Palestinian state would solve everything, or the problem is even deeper and they question the legitimacy of the state of Israel. These are indeed two very basic challenges that we have to face.
And of course, these calls for a state of Palestine continue to misrepresent the current situation, the status quo, which is that Palestinians, of course, have self-determination. They have self-governance in areas A and B of the West Bank since the Oslo Accords. They have self-governance in Gaza, of course, since the unilateral withdrawal, and we've seen the consequences of that. Einat, one question in particular, which is directed to you, and please feel free to weigh in with the justification for the 7th also, whether you think that we'll see more countries defunding UNRWA. I know that you are at the forefront of a significant campaign on this. Do you think it's gaining traction, and do you think we'll see more results as a consequence of this issue being addressed?
The issue, the short answer is not without highlighting what the organization really is about. And at this point, it's not just about the funding. Adi and I are now about to publish in Hebrew a short piece that basically says, okay, right now in the US, maybe people are trying to shape a new Middle East, but we can't make the same mistakes that we've been making for the last few decades, in which we either turned a blind eye or allowed the fueling of Palestinianism to continue and even supported it. And basically, what needs to happen is whatever arrangement is made in Syria, Lebanon, Gaza, Palestinian Authority, it has to be clear that these are not Palestine refugees. There are no Palestine refugees in Gaza. There are no Palestine refugees in the Palestinian Authority. And Syria and Lebanon should also finally put an end to the notion that Syrian and Lebanese-born Arabs are somehow Palestine refugees into the fifth generation. So the issue is not just the funding, because what we've discovered is that when you deal with funding, people immediately look for the replacement. And I saw that one of the questions is, what will replace UNRWA? There's a short video, one of my favorite that I did, answering the question of what will replace UNRWA is one of my favorite. And I say the short answer is two words: Palestinian responsibility. Because there is no actual objective problem in Gaza. There's no, it's an area that has everything needed for people to sustain themselves with agriculture, with trade. The fact that we've gotten used to images of trucks and trucks and trucks going into Gaza, as if Gaza is in this constant need of nourishment, rather than people remembering that this area has everything necessary for a self-sustaining and even very successful economy if its people actually decided to focus on building for themselves rather than on destroying what the Jews have built. And everything Adi and I try to do is to bring people back to this fundamental notion. The problem is not UNRWA per se. The problem is not the refugees per se. The problem is not the return per se. The problem is that we have an entire people, and it's a tragedy, who have been allowed to organize themselves with Western support and UN legitimacy for this singular purpose of ensuring that ultimately the Jewish state goes down in history as a momentary aberration in the history of the region. And that's what has to be rid of. And again, mostly to Israel. If Israel doesn't even speak that language, what chance do we have of having our best allies speak that language? If Netanyahu and Dermer now in America are not ensuring that any arrangement with Syria, with Lebanon, and Gaza, and the Palestinian Authority puts an end to the idea of perpetual refugeehood and return, I will be bold and say they will have achieved nothing, and I don't care how many ceremonies and handshakes on manicured lawns they're going to get out of it.
I appreciate neither of them are here to defend their approach. It might be something along the lines of pick your battles. I don't know, but certainly what we see, what they see from there, we don't see from here. But I do want to focus for a moment on the Israeli approach to this, because it's plain to me from what you have just said, but also from Adi's reference to the language continuously deployed by Yahya Sinwar that foreshadowed what ultimately took place on the 7th of October, everything couched in these terms of return, why this wasn't taken seriously, why the writing on the wall was simply, it seems, ignored, and whether there's anything that we can draw out of that. And if I can link this to one of the questions we've had from the audience with regard to the 7th of October, this questioner asks, don't you think that it's a strange coincidence the former US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, a couple of days before these terrible events, publicly announced that the atmosphere in the Middle East is quieter and nothing like this is happening? Can we assume that the reasons for the failure of intelligence might be sought not in Jerusalem, but rather in Washington? I have to confess, I don't remember Jake Sullivan saying those specific words, but it sounds like something that he might have said at that time. Is there a link in terms of this intelligence failure by Israel, perhaps by the United States, and this refusal to recognize what the rhetoric had been building up to? Adi, you mentioned the rhetoric of Sinwar in particular. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, so first of all, I think Jake Sullivan published a piece either in foreign policy or in foreign affairs with that notion of the Middle East is so peaceful as it wasn't, in the last century or whatever. So he published something like that. And to be honest, this is what you're asking is the now it's perhaps we should say the $1 billion question. I don't have a good answer. I can only suggest my thoughts. Um, First of all, and this problem persists to this day, I think there's a very strong thinking in Israel, which is very much based on a military way of thinking, which I hear, for example, today, which goes like this. There's no more Hamas. We basically, there's no, how they say, there's no organization such as Hamas. They don't pose any threat to Israel. It doesn't even matter if we finish the war or don't finish the war because Hamas does not pose a threat. Now, my problem with it is that, if we go back to World War II and take it as an example, yes, it is true that the first phase, or a very important phase of finishing the war, was actually destroying the German army. Actually, conquering, going and, conquering Berlin and putting the red flag or the American flag in Berlin or wherever. But that was not enough, right? That's indeed the military stage. But then there was an entire project of turning Germany from a Nazi state to a member of the Western New World Order. So just saying that because we killed 10,000 Hamas people, we finished the job, this is simply not true. Nothing has changed with the ideology of the rest of the 2 million people. So let's say we didn't kill 10,000, but 20,000, okay? But these children, or even youngsters, teenagers who are now 8 years old, 10 years old, 12 years old, they still get the same stories. They will still continue to learn from the same books, from the same teachers, continue, perceiving themselves as refugees in 5 years, and if I'm optimistic, we'll have another 7th of October or a version of 7th of October because this is what they want. This is what they are looking for. So I'm very much frustrated with the point that, and I agree that the military phase is extremely important. You cannot change a country before you do that. That Japan had to go through 2 atomic bombs. It's not only words, it's not only changing hearts and minds, etc. No, sometimes you need hard power, and that is exactly what the IDF is doing, and very good so. But that's not enough. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to say. And to your question, I think one of the reasons is that there's a very narrow looking, which is very strong in Israel because the military is very strong. And then there's some kind of a, honestly, I don't know why there's not enough emphasis on the other steps that we must take. And what Einat said about Syria, Lebanon, for example, they're talking about a prospect for a Palestinian state. That Saudi Arabia, for example, is insisting that Netanyahu or someone, the Israeli government, will recognize some kind of a path to a Palestinian statehood. Okay, I understand, but you have to make it very concrete. We're actually fed up with declarations and all kinds of promises. We want concrete steps. So, for example, if the Palestinians want indeed to have their own self-rule or whatever you want to call it, they have to stop their war against the Jews, recognize that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, understand that they're not refugees, that they don't return anywhere, that they don't need UNRWA. These would be very concrete steps. For example, you want to have your own state or whatever, we'll see what it is. You have to abolish all refugee camps, take away all refugee cards. When we'll see that all of this is happening, then it's a different ballgame and we'll be very, very close to, wrapping up this conflict. But just killing, or what, as they say in Hebrew, they say mowing the lawn, right? They say like each time you have to kill this and this number of terrorists. Yes, it's true. I agree. And what I'm suggesting is not something that perhaps will happen tomorrow, but we have to put the political agenda on the table, and at least as a goal, this is what the Palestinians should do in order to join the family of nations. Until that, no assistance, no money, no political assistance. And this is the roadmap that we need to have. I still don't see it. Certainly not in the West, but not in Israel as well.
And of course, one Palestinian leader after another has been pretty upfront that the creation of a Palestinian state would simply serve as a launch pad to completing this further vision for return, which entails the annihilation of Israel. Einat, can I bring you in on this also? But is there anything that we can glean from the calls that Adi has outlined that seem to completely ignore the current existence of Palestinian self-governance? That is ultimately what underlines the insistence of, a two-state solution. It is the false narrative that Israel is somehow controlling Palestinians in Palestinian-controlled territory in the West Bank and in Gaza.
So first, I want to address this notion that you kind of said as an aside, pick your battles. This is exactly my argument. This is the battle. This is the most important battle. I mean, I don't know if here I am even more extreme than Adi. Also, if you look at October 7th, if you look at like the devastation of the misnamed Second Intifada, it is Palestinianism that has incurred the greatest amount of suffering and death in the last few decades, if not before. So, and yet somehow, and it has to do a bit with this military focus, everyone wants to focus on Iran and Syria and Lebanon. And I'm like, I'm sorry, you need to do the hard work of dealing with the very unpleasant fact of the enemy at our doorstep. You know, the Soviet Union is gone. The Mullah regime in Iran can go tomorrow, and still our big battle will be with Palestinianism. So it's not pick our battles. This is the battle. And if we will miss again the opportunity to finally deal with the core issues, then we are just leaving the biggest issue on the table. And there is a tendency among Israeli leaders and military, there's a great word in Hebrew that all English translations offered to me fell short, is zilzul, a complete like looking down, underestimation of the Palestinians as an actual threat. So the fact is that when you talk about a Palestinian state, and this is what you alluded to, I've over the years have come to call it Schrodinger's Palestine, because as I'm sure you know, Palestine is recognized by about 147 countries, Israel merely recognized by 164. So we're not much more a recognized state than they are. But somehow Palestine gets the following kind of treatment. Is Palestine a state for the purpose of assuming responsibility that no one is a refugee in Palestine, for assuming responsibility for surrendering? You know, people tell me, who will surrender? They have a state, they have a head of state, the head of state can surrender in this war. Can they assume responsibility for the fact that the state of Palestine invaded Israel? No. If the question is Palestine a state for the purpose of assuming actual responsibility? No. Is Palestine a state for the purpose of making life miserable for Israel and international bodies? You spoke very eloquently, Natasha, about how the ICC used the notion that Palestine is a state to create this bizarre notion that Israel and the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense can be prosecuted. So is Palestine a state for the purpose of making life miserable in international bodies for Israel? Yes, then Palestine is a state. So you're absolutely right that everyone plays around with this notion of Schrodinger's Palestine. Palestine doesn't have responsibility for anything that it actually matters, but somehow it exists if it makes life miserable for Israel.
Einat, I just want to pick up on your reference to yourself as extreme, or at least more extreme than Adi, and I appreciate it's all relative, but I appreciate we've got a tremendous number of people who've joined this webinar, and I fully anticipate that many of them will not be aware of your politics, both you and Adi, your political history, perhaps. You as a left-wing member of Knesset, Adi as a writer, including for Haaretz, and perhaps the journey that the two of you have come on. And I just wondered if you might be able to take a few minutes just to reassure our audience that the throwaway comment that you made with respect to extreme positions here is it has to necessarily be seen in the context of both of you very much coming from the left of the political spectrum. And can I just add into that mix, perhaps as a question, how do you see the left and the right in Israel specifically being receptive to the arguments that you are making? Has there been a change in receptiveness since the 7th of October, or are you experiencing the same sort of intransigence that you seem to be highlighting with respect to Israel's leadership? Perhaps I can ask Einat, seeing as you use the term extremism, to
Okay, so I'll
give
start.
us some background on that.
So first, I'll just say that when I said more extreme than a D, is more extreme in the fact that I believe that the only real battle and enemy that matters for Israel is Palestinianism. That, the Soviet Union will go, Iran, the Mullah regime will go. This is the battle that matters. In many ways, you could say that this is a very left-wing position. I sometimes joke that we argue that the left wing was right in saying, through the Abraham Accords and all that, you cannot ignore the Palestinians. You cannot ignore the Palestinians. We absolutely agree with this left wing position. And then what we argue is that once you stop ignoring the Palestinians and you listen to them, then you realize that their position is given a few individual courageous exceptions, is a blanket rejection of the Jewish right to self-determination. And that's what I mean that I'm more extreme, because Adi might give Iran some room as a key enemy, or I don't know. I'm like, I don't care. They are ultimately not the enemy that matters. That's what I mean in terms of an extreme position, in terms of what is the battle that really matters. In terms of my personal journey, and Adi will speak to his. We also discuss it in the book, in many talks, but basically, it's what everyone likes to call today in woke world lived experience. We lived through the complete collapse of the various efforts made by successive Israeli governments to allow Palestinians either sovereignty, statehood, control of territory, only to see it collapse in the most bloody and violent ways again and again and again. And both of us went back to the drawing table and began to ask, what's going on? What kind of people who claim to be a self-determination and liberation movement don't say yes to statehood and territory when they get a chance? And we didn't have to dig far to realize that, again, to the credit of Palestinians, they've always said that their top priority was from the river to the sea, no Jewish state, return. Basically, in the book, we define Palestinianism as four key tenets: from the river to the sea, there will be no Jewish state, and Palestinians will therefore maintain themselves as perpetual refugees until return. And return is October 7th. So our process was basically what you call lived experience, or what some people call mugged by reality. We thought and hoped that a Palestinian state or disengagement from territory will lead to peace. It led to the opposite. We re-examined our assumptions and realized that other assumptions better explain the situation.
Adi, I absolutely want you to be able to address your own journey, but can I include another question from the audience, which asks whether you have received pushback or criticism since connecting October 7 to the ideology of return? Perhaps you could address those two.
Yes. Okay. So first of all, regarding the first question, so Einat described, I think, very well the trajectory or the journey, which is, already something like 30 years from the 90s, from the days of the Oslo Accords. And more to the point of the politics, so whenever I'm asked whether I am a left wing or a right wing, so my politics is very clear, and I can sum it up in one sentence. I want to live freely as a human being. That's it. I'm not a leftist. I'm not a rightist. I just want to live freely in my own country. Okay? And I want to add something. I don't want to ruin our, to make it hard for the PR, but it's not a jolly book. Okay? We're not happy to inform you that this is a tragedy. The fact, I mean, I would be very happy to come back from my research with different results. This is not something which I say very lightly because I understand that it means basically that the state of Israel, with about 8 or 9 million Jews, we are being surrounded by millions, tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of people who do not accept us. And as we saw on October 7th, at the first moment of our weakness, they, as Einat says, commit butchery. So I would be very much, happy to, oh no, we have so many Arabs around us and Palestinians. No, that's not true. I don't feel vindicated in the sense that, here we are. No, this is a very sad reality, but this is the reality. And we have to treat it as it is. Okay, so that's a little bit about where I stand. I'm not happy. I'm actually very sad, but I think that we have to deal with it better than we do. Um, just one more thing about politics. I don't think that in Israel today there's any notion of being leftist or rightist. Unfortunately, there's only one thing. It's whether you like Bibi or whether you like and dislike is a very light word, perhaps worship or detest him. I don't know. It's like, there's like Bibi camp and the Raklo Bibi. Like this is it. So we don't. I think that among the population, certainly after 7th of October, what Einat and I say, I want to think that 70 or 80% of the Jews agree with. It's just, the politics have not changed enough to reflect the fact that we, I think and hope, represent a very large majority. Now, as to the pushback, you asked about pushback. No. And, even before 7th of October, the only comment that we received from Palestinians and from Arabs was, nobody said, you didn't understand well, we don't want return, we're not refugees, etc., etc. They didn't like our recommendations, right? They didn't like the fact that we wanted to, change this whole establishment, but they said, yes, of course, this is what we wanted all along. Of course, we consider ourselves refugees. Of course, we consider you to be illegitimate. Of course, Ramle and Yafo and Haifa is ours. Of course, you should go back to Poland and Russia, and they forget Iraq and Morocco and Yemen, right? Because this is not so pleasant. This was the pushback. So we don't have a disagreement over the facts before October 7th and even afterwards.
So I want to come on to your recommendations as in the next 10 minutes we're bringing the webinar to a conclusion. But I did just want to pose a couple of additional questions, excuse me, from the audience. And one asks, I never hear it mentioned that the tens of thousands of Iraqi Arabs migrated to the new state of Israel in 1948. I would have perhaps suggested in the years up to 1948 to work on construction. They then brought families over and merged into the local populations. So simply in terms of where one starts the sort of historical clock and where these individuals are purporting to wish to return to, is there much discussion, perhaps Einat, on the origins of many of these individuals? Of course, there's been lots of discussion, sometimes by historians, of Palestinian names and the geographical origins outside of the region, specifically of Israel, that they demonstrate. But what are your thoughts on this particular question of specifically Iraqi Arabs migrating to the state of Israel for work purposes?
So this also begins to touch on the recommendations about Palestinianism, where we say that Palestinianism is an ideology, must die, so that Jews and Arabs can finally live. The tragedy is that whether it is migrant workers from Iraq or Egypt or Syria or seasonal workers from Lebanon who came into the north and nearly escaped back to Lebanon, whether it's Bedouins or Levantines, by now, all of that has been submerged under the ideology and identity of Palestinianism. That's the tragedy. And therefore, this is what needs to go away. The fact that, and this is where sometimes our recommendation sounds somewhat harsher than it is, because people believe that we are about erasing the identity of a people, and we're not. We're about erasing the ideology. We're about erasing Nazism so that what's left are Germans. We're about erasing Japanese racial imperialism. So that's what are left are Pikachu creating Japanese. So it's about leaving them as Arabs who are ultimately not Palestinianists. And I saw that there was a question about the Hebron. Once Palestinianism is no longer the ideological glue that binds together the Arabs of Gaza and the West Bank and millions in Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, you can come up with various political solutions. They can be emirates, they can be states, they can be, being annexed to Jordan and Egypt, they can be Arab protectorates. You can come up with a whole bunch of political solutions that open up only once Palestinianism is no longer the ideology that connects all the people, all the Arabs in the land, regardless of how they came to the land and what initially brought them here, because that is by now long gone. The recommendations in the book, in the last chapter, essentially talk about how Israel needs to wake up every morning and chip away at the four core tenets of Palestinianism. The notion that the land is from the river to the sea and that there's no Jewish connection there, that completely we need to bring to an end the notion that the Arabs are Palestine refugees. We need to make it clear that there's no such thing as a right of return. Adi and I imagine Israel's foreign ministry waking up every morning, knocking at the door of the legal department of every foreign ministry and saying, when are you going to issue a legal opinion that says that there's no right of return? It actually doesn't exist. So this is about what we say about chipping away at Palestinianism. So then you are left with the Arabs who are not obsessed with destroying Israel, and then political options open up.
In fact, the question as to the Sheikh of Hebron's attempt now or indication of his desire to join the Abraham Accords was one of the next questions I was looking to pose. There are a number of questions that have been put about the Abraham Accords, about potential alternative solutions to the one that we have discussed as inextricably linked with this false narrative of a right of return. Adi, picking up on that, can I ask you one of the questions from the audience that seeks the legal or political mechanisms, if any, to challenge both the refugee status of the Palestinians and the implications of the right of return, and whether or not there are avenues outside of the diplomacy that Einat has highlighted that need to be pursued by Israel in parallel.
So let's take, for example, this new initiative in Hebron. So I think, first of all, that something very crucial is happening in the sense that these sheikhs or these heads of clans or whatever you want to call them said in that letter, supposedly, that they acknowledge or recognize Israel to be the nation state of the Jewish people. This is something that we have never heard before from any Palestinian leader, not Arafat, not Abu Mazen, certainly not Hamas. So this is why I'm even starting the conversation, because the fact that they want to have more money and they want to get rid of the corrupt Palestinian Authority is kind of an inner Palestinian issue. It's less of interest for me. But I would go further and say, okay, if you are serious and you indeed understand and acknowledge and you have no territorial, demands from the state of Israel, and all you want to do is give better education to your kids, etc., and in the governorate or whatever, in the district of Hebron, then the next step is that you take out UNRWA from the district of Hebron, You dismantle refugee camps, there are a few. Say out loud that you're not a refugee and in your clans or under your jurisdiction, there are no refugees and you do not return to anywhere. This would be dramatic. And it's more than just a declaration, because if you practically stop issuing refugee cards, take out UNRWA, this is serious. This is actually something that we have never seen in the last 100 years, or let's say in the case of the refugees after 48. So in that sense, I do think that it's interesting, but we have to wait to see for more details and have to work harder. And I can tell you that these are let's say recommendations that I'm trying to push forward and to try to let's say not remain in that again. I think I don't know if it's Israelis are so happy that someone is willing to say that, but there is such a huge frustration regarding the Palestinians. On the other hand, we know that they're here, right? We're not Russia that we can say, oh, it's like 10 hours by train. No, it's practically 5 minutes, as we've seen on October 7th. So there's a problem. It's huge. It's not very easy to solve. But I do hope that if indeed they are ready for that. I don't know if they're ready for that, because this is something very dramatic. This is basically breaking away with the entire Palestinian narrative for the last 100 years. If they were willing to do that, then this is something that should be very much encouraged, very much supported, and be, like a model for the rest of the area.
This very point is actually reflected in one of the questions from the audience, who references the deal that was offered to Arafat, in respect of which the main sticking point, of course, was the right of return. Rabin's refusal to concede, Arafat's comment that if he agreed a deal without the right of return, he would be assassinated. So the questioner asks how any Palestinian leader can possibly get over this hurdle. That is the singular question here, isn't it? This break with decades of intransigence on this point. If I could just very briefly highlight that question on the Abraham Accords, which links to another question from the audience. Do you think that the extension of the Abraham Accords will have the effect of improving attitudes towards Israel and the Jews? Of course, the original book, which is phenomenal and still so relevant. So until the translation of the updated one is out, I encourage people to read it. Talks very expertly about the initiative of Arab countries to keep the war of annihilation against Israel alive through UNRWA, through essentially using the Palestinian people as pawns in this war against Israel, the continuing war against Israel. So is there a potential avenue forward in surrounding states making peace with Israel, entering into normalization agreements to start to, as Einat has outlined, chip away at Palestinianism and the false narrative that has seen it become so entrenched? Adi, do you see a role for the Accords in that respect?
So I think that if you look back to the initial Abraham Accords with the UAE and Bahrain, I think they were very, very important in showing the way that you can make peace with the Jews, and that it doesn't mean that the Jews have to commit suicide in order for a peace agreement to happen. And in the sense that the Palestinians started to feel that the Arab world is no longer behind them. And these were extremely important factors. But I agree with Einat that as we move forward towards countries which are actually our real neighbors, such as Lebanon, Syria, and I don't know what kind of structure will happen in Gaza and in the West Bank, we have to touch this issue. We have to declare and make it very clear. Listen, there are only two options. Either we have war, which is what we have now and for the last 100 years, or we have peace. Just to say Abraham Accords and for children in Ramallah to continue to be taught that one day they will take over Tel Aviv, I don't consider that to be peace, okay? And not only teaching them, but providing them with UN agency and money and refugee cards and, et cetera, as we explained. No. And if they're unwilling to move towards peace, then let it be known that we are at war. I mean, this is just had to be clear. I'm not sure that the Palestinians are ready for that, but we have to understand that all the rest is a charade. You know, all the rest is like makeup. It's like, oh, let's have a revitalized Palestinian Authority. What does it even mean? Are we interested in the way that the Palestinians pay salaries and how they, collect garbage? This is not the question. The question is whether or not they're willing to end their war against us. So regarding the Abraham Accords, I'm very much in favor. I think, again, in military, looking at it, it's extremely important to have security arrangements with Syria and Lebanon. All of it is very important. But leaving it as it is will not solve the problem. It will be some kind of, we conceive ourselves. It's a trap. And we have to remember that certainly after October 7th, we have to be very alert exactly for those kinds of traps.
Well, just to continue Einat's tradition of using English phrases, the "you cannot put lipstick in on a pig" very much comes to mind in those concluding words of
Exactly.
yours, Adi. I'm so tremendously grateful. I'm sorry we haven't managed to get through all of the questions. Lots of people talking in particular about the parties benefiting from the current setup, politically, socially, economically, UNRWA's role, the role of NGOs, likewise. There is such a challenge to be addressed here, but as you say, it is not a jolly book. But it is so necessary to recognize the reality in order to start to be able to grapple with it and come up with the sorts of proposals that you have already put forward to overcome this significant challenge. Lots of people asking when the English translation will be available. I've been told soon, but I'm sure that UKLFI will notify our membership as and when it is out. Tremendously grateful for the work that both of you continue to do, grappling with this vital, fundamental, central issue. And thank you so much also to record numbers of our audience that continue to turn out and the questions that they've posed. Thank you so much to all of you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.